Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'll be doing a little response video to the debate that was had between Lawrence Krauss and William Lane Craig on if science buried God. Alright, well let's get down to it.
There are two things I want to do before I start my presentation. One was disagree with you completely. You committed the other journalistic error of saying journalists like to think there's always two sides to every story, but the great thing about science is one side is usually wrong.
Error. Actually in science, usually both sides are wrong, it's just we can't show how one side is wrong yet. Models are abstractions and are usually based on inductive reasoning, so they're probabilistic estimations of the truth. As British statistician George Bach says, all models are wrong, some are useful. And as the famous German physicist Max Planck says, a new scientific truth does not trump by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar to it.
And the other was that you said religion and science are rivals, but that's like saying Bambi and Godzilla are rivals.
Well, Bambi and Godzilla were considered enemies in the late 1960s cartoon of them.
So I come here not to bury God, but to praise honesty, full disclosure, and skeptical empirical inquiry, which, alas, are burying God.
None of those things are traits you possess. Seeing your hot tub scandal, relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, and the fact you had to lie about what your fellow scientist Alexander Vilenkin said regarding the science.
What really matters to me is the ethics of science, open questioning, the fact that there are no scientific authorities, that we believe in honesty, transparency, reliance on evidence, peer review, and testability. All of these, I believe, make the world a better place.
LOL, science has no authorities? Who has the most authority in science depends really on who is getting more money from the government or private investor in a given year, and who knows the institutional politics the best. We live in an era where a guy can have 5 or 6 papers published in a scientific field, or in the case of Bill Nye, just be an engineer, an actor, and that alone makes them an authority on science because they were capable of getting media attention.
The title of this thing, as you just pointed out, has one problem, but it has two problems. Has science buried God suggests that there's one God. Like the God that the people who organize this thing and William believe in is somehow special. But that's not true. There are lots of gods, and science has buried all of them. Human civilization began by putting purpose and intelligent purpose behind gods associated with the sun, the moon, the planets, the wind, the earth, the oceans. It's been, by one estimate, over 1,000 different gods throughout human history. Mars, god of war, Poseidon, Thor, all the rest. And the really important thing is that all of you, or almost all of you probably, are now atheists regarding those gods. Just the only difference is it's just one that we may disagree about. But 999, we all agree, have been thrown out. And the reason they've been thrown out is they've been buried by the rise of our physical understanding. Science works. And the fact that science works has buried the gods of the wind and the sun and the moon. Farmers now, as I was just saying, when it doesn't rain, they don't pray for rain anymore. They go see a meteorologist.
You are committing an equivocation fallacy. You are comparing a deity like, say, Thor with a supreme being like, say, Yahweh, which is like confusing toast with the toaster. To quote David Hart in his Experience of God book, beliefs regarding fairies are beliefs about a certain kind of object that may or may not exist within the world, and such beliefs have much the same sort of intentional shape and rational content as beliefs regarding one's neighbors over the hill, or whether there are such things as black swans. Beliefs regarding God concern the source and ground of all and end of all reality, the unity and existence of every particular thing and of the totality of all things, the ground of the possibility of anything at all. You show a lack of knowledge in the field of mythos, as like I've gone over in my series on the subject with many cultures, they weren't trying to explain where lightning came from, why volcanoes erupted, etc., because they didn't know where where those things came from, and so invoked the gods. They wanted to put a face on these things that they didn't know about, and so gods became a useful shorthand for it that allowed a shared story to arise from it that could then be made to help with social cohesion. You also commit the false dichotomy fallacy. You don't have to choose between praying and asking a scientist. You can do both. Hinduism alone has way more than 1,000 gods, and philosophically speaking, to say atheism is a lack of belief is absurd, although I hold that if you want to hold it to an incoherent definition for your beliefs, you should be free to do so. Just don't be hurt when people point out it's incoherent.
Now, this one God is supposedly left. We might ask a priori or in advance, how likely is in advance that all those other 999 gods were false, but this one's true? Well, you might argue, if you had a flat prior, that it's probably pretty small likelihood. But it doesn't really matter. The point is that our current understanding of nature has changed. We've learned things. It's changed and developed since the claims were made by Iron Age peasants who didn't even know the Earth orbited the sun. And therefore, it's natural that science is inconsistent with those claims based on ignorance. And we shouldn't revere those ancient claims as sacred.
Chronological snobbery fallacy and genetic fallacy, and a version of the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy as well. Given how many cultures have believed the Earth had different shapes to it, what makes your Earth shape any different than their Earth shape? You clearly don't believe the Earth is a square, a rectangle, a dodecahedron, a cylinder, etc. Science has buried those shapes of the Earth. What makes you think science won't bury yours? Now, I hope you can see how stupid the statement you made was. If it weren't for these Iron Age peasants, you wouldn't have the privilege of being able to pontificate on this subject matter. We stand on their shoulders and the sacrifices they made to get us here. I'll also like to add that age doesn't determine the truth value for things like this. Notions like 2 + 2 = 4 are ancient, going as far back as when the first caveman decided to count stones.
There's a lot we don't know about the universe, a lot more we don't know than we do. That's the wonder of science. That's why I'm a scientist. But it is intellectually lazy to just stop asking questions and stop looking for physical explanations and just say God did it. That's lazy.
Not really, actually, if you believe in brute facts, which say not just do we not have the information currently to explain something, but that in principle it is impossible to explain something like, say, the universe. It just would be it. It just is. Also, it is actually more rare than you think for anyone, whether or not they believe in God or not, to say, I don't know, therefore X. Christian philosopher Dr. Alan Rauda in Ignorance, Incredulity, and God of the Gaps talked about how most people don't frame it like that. Say, if X were the case, we would expect evidence for it, and because it is or isn't there, it is true or false.
First of all, there's no empirical evidence that he was divine. None, not one iota. In that sense, he shares it with every other god that's ever been proposed. The myths associated with Jesus are associated with all the other myths, and the Bible. The flood myth, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written well before the Bible, exactly the same. The hero of the Bible was asked to create an ark and put all the species 2 by 2 on 7 levels. Same thing. Virgin birth, nothing special about Jesus. Oh, look at all these. They're all supposed to have been born of virgins. The whole story, in fact, take Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, versus Jesus. It's exactly the same. They were both born from a virgin mother. They were fathered by the King of Heaven. They were returned from the dead. They transformed water into wine. In fact, they, talked about eating and drinking the flesh and blood of the Creator. They were taken as a liberator of mankind. That story has been told over and over again, and this is just one of the most recent renderings. Nothing special. And the resurrection is nothing special. The myth of resurrection has been around since Osiris. Osiris was one of the major Egyptian gods, and it used to be just the kings in Egypt would be resurrected when Osiris was resurrected. But eventually, in the New Kingdom, anyone could be resurrected with Osiris. I was going to say with Jesus, but it doesn't matter. If they follow the correct religious rituals, the same nonsense.
First off, how can you have natural evidence that something is supernatural? This seems to be a category error on Krauss's part. Also, as guys like Shermer, Dawkins, Atkins, Dillahunty, Bohasian, etc. have all said pretty much nothing could convince them that God exists, and that any scientific evidence for, say, a God could be explained by, say, aliens. Also, if by empirical you mean just experience through the senses, many people back in Jesus' time claimed to have experienced him rise from the dead and even apparently hung out with him. Would that be empirical? Now, I'm not saying that really happened, I'm just asking for a criterion. In regards to the flood, there is no direct connection between the Epic of Gilgamesh and the biblical flood narrative. It is far more likely they both were drawing upon a common event and interpreted it in their own way independently of one another. As John Botero in the book Everyday Life in Ancient Mesopotamia says, though the more than substantial entity with the Babylonian flood is not in the least doubt, there are too many divergent details between the two for the account in Genesis to be regarded simply as a transcription into Hebrew of the Akkadian text of Adrahasis or Gilgamesh. And in regards to the virgin birth correlations, biblical scholar Raymond Brown has the following to say: while non-Jewish parallels to Jesus' conceptions have been found in the figures of world religions, in Greco-Roman mythology, in the births of the pharaohs, and in the marvelous births of the emperors and philosophers, these parallels consistently involve a type of hieros gamos, where a divine male in human or other form impregnates a woman either through normal sexual intercourse or through some substitute form of penetration. They are not really similar to the non-sexual virginal conception that is at the core of the infancy narratives concerning Jesus, a conception where there is no male deity or element to impregnate Mary. In regards to the whole apparent Egyptian resurrection account, non-religious biblical scholar Bar Ehrman says, the alleged parallels between Jesus and the pagan savior gods in most instances reside in the modern imagination. We do not have accounts of others who were born to virgin mothers and who died as an atonement for sin and were raised from the dead. Also, existence of a pattern really doesn't mean much at times with historical reliability. It is likely whether or not a gospel writer had knowledge they were writing history or not would follow a pattern common for the day. As folklorist expert Dr. Alan Dundes in the book The Quest for the Hero, the fact that a hero's biography conforms to the Indo-European hero pattern does not necessarily mean that the hero never existed. It suggests rather the folk repeatedly insist upon making their versions of the lives of heroes follow the lines of a specific series of incidences. Accordingly, if the life of Jesus conforms in any way with the standard hero pattern, this proves nothing one way or the other with respects to the historicity of Jesus. Simply put, the argument doesn't even get off the ground. A Christian could always make the argument that God was providentially gearing pagans for the coming of Christ by making them come to certain theological conclusions in their mythology, and so the fact Jesus conforms to them is to be expected. Now, I personally believe the alleged parallels are at best too broad to get anywhere.
And the fact is, frankly, that in the Western world at least, the number of people who have religious affiliations monotonically going down. But it depends on where you live. If you were born in the U.S., and you're religious, you believe in the Bible and Jesus. If you're born in India and you're religious, you might believe in Brahman and who's manifest through Gensha. If you're from the Islamic world, you think the Quran is the perfect word of God and Muhammad is the latest prophet. It's kind of interesting that your belief depends on where you're from. But what's great is we live in a world where information is becoming more freely available. And because of that global access to information, we are seeing religion go down. Because people are learning that the myths and lies that they've been taught, when they learn about the rest of the world, that other people believe other myths and lies that are inconsistent with their myths and lies.
Lawrence fetishizes the internet here. While yes, more information is out there, good and bad information is equally abundant. I'd bet good money that the plethora of anti-science conspiracy theories that have arisen in the past couple of years wouldn't have been able to get as popular as they have been if the internet wasn't around. Simply put, what we are seeing is what I call the death of expertise phenomenon, which is partially based on the title of a book, an article by one Tom Nichols, where people are dismissing any and all authorities in their pursuit of rampant individualism. Dr. Steve Turley goes into this dying Christianity idea in the video Christianity is Surging Throughout the World and in many other videos. I can attest to some of this, as I believe what is partially happening is you're getting people who were nominal Christians, who just claim to be Christians because of social benefits, are just stopping claiming that they are Christians because the benefits are just not there anymore.
Newton, who was a religious man, spent more time writing about God than physics, in fact. Also, however, got rid of angels pushing planets around the sun because he didn't need them. They were gone. Darwin, once he recognized natural selection and evolution, got rid of the notion of special creation for each species. You didn't need God and miracles anymore to create each species. The divine spark that caused life in the first place is not so divine. Everything we now know about biochemistry and the discovery of complex amino acids in space tells us that it's quite likely that the complex organic molecules on which life is based either arose in space or developed on Earth. We don't know the origin of life, as I'll talk about, but it's certainly plausible now that you don't need a divine spark.
The idea that angels were pushing planets around was just that, an idea amongst other ideas that were played around with, which was based on an interpretation of Aristotle. Kepler and many others weren't fans of it, not because it invoked the supernatural, but that it didn't seem to fit the data they were getting, and didn't make sense to them philosophically. Darwin's earliest supporters were Christians, and many of them were his friends. They didn't view Darwin's theory as problematic. Darwin's theory didn't catch Christians off guard, as they had long been fascinated by the connection between humans and animals. In regards to divine spark and biochemistry, I'll have Sygart go over it.
There's no question that DNA is the first example of true information in the universe where one thing means something else. Okay, so the sequence of DNA bases is a chemical structure that means make this protein. And that's never occurred in the universe before, and it has never occurred in the universe after, except in life, which is based on that code. So there's no question that the argument for DNA as the first case of information is something that's brand new in the universe, very likely, in my view, is a sign of God's divine action.
I'd also like to note that science is really good at describing things, but not really with explaining what the thing is that it is describing. For instance, we don't know what energy actually is. We can describe it and convert it in many ways, but that doesn't actually answer what it is. I like to say it's like giving an artistic blind person a ruler and a blank canvas and reading the instructions of a blueprint of a microwave to them. Dr. Ed Fazer, in his article, The Materialist Shell Game, goes into the sort of argument Krauss goes into, where Krauss says, knowledge of the physical world buries God. A materialist like Krauss is married to a mechanistic conception of matter that defines away anything that doesn't fit as being just a mental projection and not part of the material world at all. The mind is swept under the rug, and guys like Krauss are saying, hey, where's the mind?
Science does more than that. It doesn't just tell us about the world. It makes the world a better place. It gets rid of the vile, awful, immoral works like the Bible. The worldview that I would argue guides most of you in this room today, including those of you people of faith, which I assume is some fraction of the people in this audience. Those spiritual values of any educated person today are largely the worldview given us by science. Your worldview is vastly different than it would have been 4 centuries ago. By stripping ecclesiastical authority of its credibility on factual matters, which we've certainly done, we cast doubt on its claims to certainty in matters of morality, which is great, because we now think that women are equal to men, that we don't hate gays, all of the stupid myths that are permeated by various religions. The facts of science, moreover, force us to take responsibility for the welfare of ourselves, our species, and our planet. And that is what we need to do in the 21st century.
Lawrence, science is a tool. It is like a shovel. It is only as moral as the person using it. A shovel by itself is neither good or bad. If you lay it on the ground and do nothing with it, nothing will happen. A shovel, like science by itself, has no care about you or your family or your society. Scientists who use science care about those things. Science can provide information that better informs our morality, but it can't tell us what we ought to do. It can tell us, for example, having a homosexual desires isn't a choice in the same way it can tell us that being predisposed to being an alcoholic isn't a choice. However, it wouldn't tell us, for example, whether or not you should act on homosexual desire or whether or not you should act on the predisposition to be an alcoholic. Racism and eugenics are positions people held to that many of them felt was backed by science. For every new advancement that science gets, there is someone that wants to use it for evil. Nuclear energy has and still does provide us a great deal of utility, but it also has been developed into bombs that kill people. Studying diseases has allowed us to come up with cures for diseases, while also allowing people to come up with ways of making and modifying diseases so it can be inflicted on a population of people. Now, I believe humans' use of science has done more good to the world than harm, but like I've been saying, it's a trade-off. What ethical conclusions people derive from science are the ones they've inserted into it.
Dr. Craig is an apologist, and there's good reason to apologize. One of the first apologists in the year 208 wrote, this is great, "The Son of God died just because it is absurd, it is to be believed. And he was buried and rose again. It is certain because it is impossible." That's the rationality of an apologist. Apologists often conjure up a veneer of rational justification and evidential support for their God by distorting and misrepresenting results of science and logic, something Dr. Craig does exceptionally well. In doing so, they do a disservice to everyone, including people of faith, which is why I came here, because the people of honest faith should recognize when things are being distorted. St. Augustine once said, if you want to go out and convince the heathen of your God, you better show that you're not lying about the real world.
Tertullian never said that. He was responding to the Marcionite view that downplayed Jesus' suffering in the Bible and was affirming the doctrines they were denying. In the quote, he was essentially saying that the claim that Jesus died and rose from the dead seems so impossible that one shouldn't have initially believed it unless it happened and people had witnessed it. The history of literary criticism says it best. Tertullian's writings do not include the words, "I believe because it is absurd," and the origin is unknown.
We need to bury God for a bunch of reasons. This is the God we need to bury. In Deuteronomy, he said, kill all men and women. He told the Israelites, kill all the men and women in a conquered city, all the men in a conquered city, and seize the women, children, and livestock as plunder. But in the cities of these people, you should kill absolutely everybody. Now, we live in a world where you can't preach, in the modern world, in the non-fundamentalist world, where you can't preach genocide anymore because we buried God. You can't, and if someone drowns their children in a bathtub because they say God is talking to them, we put them in a mental institution. Now, Dr. Craig loves children. But to go to the lengths of enforcing belief, this is what he says. To justify this. Why take the lives of innocent children? If we believe, as I do, that God's grace is extended to those who die in infancy or as small children, the death of these children was actually their salvation. Therefore, God does these children no wrong in taking their lives. It gets worse. He went on and said, who does God wrong in commanding the destruction of the Canaanites? Not the Canaanite adults, for they were corrupt and deserving of judgment. They deserve to die. Not the kids, because they inherit eternal life. Who are the really people that we should suffer for? The poor soldiers who had to kill them. If that isn't obscene enough, Dr. Craig then, a third time, went back and thought about this and said, you know what? I've come to appreciate, as a result of a closer reading of the biblical text, that God's command to Israel was not primarily to exterminate the Canaanites, but to drive them out of the land. If they just left, no one had been killed at all. Only those who remained were to be utterly exterminated. Oh, that's great. That obscenity is the reason that my friend and colleague Richard Dawkins will not appear on stage with this man.
Dawkins actually did appear on stage with him once in a debate, but in terms of a one-on-one debate, Dawkins seems to give a new reason for not debating Craig every week. I believe Dawkins simply doesn't want to debate Craig because he knows he can't challenge Craig on the philosophy, as he's not a philosopher, and he can't debate as well as Craig because he's not a trained debater. Christians differ on the Canaanite issue. Some like to say that it wasn't talking about actual history, or that it was, but it was exaggerated, which I'm more on board with myself. To me, if I were Christian, I'd simply argue theologically God doesn't need a reason for taking anyone's life, as he's not obligated to anyone. If that's not satisfying, one could take a utilitarian approach and say that just as we might allow the killing of innocent people for good, a greater good, God could do the same. I would like to point out that historically speaking, scholars like Richard Hess have gone into how the cities, the quote-unquote cities here, would be more like forts that would be where the military is at, and the citizens would sleep outside of it. If any woman or child died in them, it would be because they were staying behind in these forts, and as such, these kids wouldn't be punished for the sins of their parents, but rather they would be impacted by the sins of their family. The point of the conquest could be said to be forced migration and not genocide, along with a form of, it could also be considered a form of capital punishment. Glenn Miller goes more into this on Christian Think Tank, which I'll link to in the description. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise. Get wise.